Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Oliver Traldi. He is a John and Daria postdoctoral research fellow at the James Madison Program at Princeton University. He studies epistemology with a focus on the epistemology of politics, and today we're talking about his book, Political Beliefs, a Philosophical Introduction. So, Oliver, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So, tell us first, perhaps, what is political epistemology and how did you get interested in that specific, sub-discipline of epistemology, I guess?
Yeah. So the second question is easier than the first one. As I was applying to PhD programs in 2017, it basically was in the early days of the Trump era, right? Of the early days of the Trump presidency. And a lot of public discussion, not discussion in academia, but public discussion about the Trump presidency and the Trump campaign and American politics around then was about epistemology in a sense, right? So you had terms like fake news, alternative facts being thrown around. You had these discussions of information bubbles, information cascades, and you had other words which to me felt a little epistemological, even though nobody else had given an account of them. Terms like normalization. You had talked conspiracy theories, things like that. So political epistemology was very much in the air in the early days, and it kind of related back to some things I'd studied as an undergraduate. As an undergraduate, I was a classics major with an interest in politics. I ended up going to law school for a year after that, and I worked on a political campaign in 2008 and things like that. And I had studied polarization in college, and I was familiar with Cass Sunstein's account of belief polarization and going to extremes, and his account of the way the internet related to that by putting people in these bubbles. There was a great article by Tyne Ginn in Eon called a public article about what he calls epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. That also there was also an academic article in Episteme on the same topic that he wrote. So I was basically seeing all this stuff about the Trump presidency, but also I was having my own doubts about, having been sort of a political progressive my whole life. I started having these questions about, why do I have so little contact with this whole other group of people who are voting in ways that nobody who I'm around ever understands. Where do their beliefs come from? Are their beliefs based on reasons? Can talking to them improve my own beliefs? This was also, it's funny that these things happened at the same time, but the Trump campaign was happening around the same time as a lot of the open science movement and Heterodox Academy and efforts like that were about, on the one hand, even things like statistical practices or peer review in the sciences, preprints, avoiding p-hacking, avoiding fraud in science. But on the other hand, about the political skew of the academy and where our supposedly expert beliefs come from and things like that. So it was basically a moment where there was all this talk of political epistemology, and I wasn't sure that it was being directed in the right way. It felt to me like maybe there was this sort of expert community that was actually the one that should be, where we should be putting a lot of critical attention. So, okay, that's sort of my personal story. Your question, what is political epistemology? Well, so we can start with, traditional epistemology. We're just thinking about, how can we justify our beliefs? How can we possibly have knowledge? What are what sources of evidence do we have? And are they good sources of evidence? Things like, mathematical intuition or perception. Those are the sorts of things that Descartes, for instance, might have been interested in. deductive versus inductive reasoning, Humean skepticism about causation, things like that. Then social epistemology is concerned about a subset of those sources, the ones where the information comes from other people. So questions about how can we tell when somebody is an expert? What should we do when somebody disagrees with us? What justifies I was in Europe a couple of months ago, which I don't travel that much. And so it was a big deal for me. You're on the street. Among other things, I didn't realize everybody speaks English, so I can just go up to somebody and ask them in English, even if it's, in Europe, in a non-English speaking country. So I go up and ask, where's the museum? Where's the modern art museum in this town? And they give me an answer. Why do I trust that answer? What licenses me in trusting that answer? So the nature of trust, the nature of other people's testimony. So that's a source of my belief about where the museum is. That's a social source. So then we get to social epistemology. Then political epistemology sort of means a few different things at once. One of them is just the epistemology of political beliefs and how we answer political questions and come to our beliefs about political questions. But that's very broad, right? So like, for example, if I've proven that, one policy will result in, a low number, say 5 injuries at my workplace, and another policy will result in 5,000 injuries at my workplace. Obviously, I need to do a little math to know that 5,000 is greater than 5. But mathematical epistemology is not generally thought of as, we just take that sort of stuff for granted once we're in the political realm, right? So the most characteristic part of political epistemology is the part that's sort of still social. So questions about political disagreement. What do we do when we disagree with others about politics? Questions about, should we trust people in our political party more than people in another political party? Are there experts in politics? So some of these questions come from the nature of politics as involving groups, right? So that there are different groups in politics, and there's questions about, okay, social epistemology, I'm thinking about how does my epistemology change based on the awareness that there are multiple people? And political epistemology, in one sense, is how does my epistemology change based on the awareness that there are multiple groups? But another aspect of political epistemology is just that there are these phenomena that happen in politics, and we want to investigate kind of all the possible epistemological contours of them. Phenomena that could be types of beliefs or types of causes of beliefs. So, for example, belief polarization seems to be something that causes our beliefs to get into sets, sort of party platforms. And also seems to be something that pushes maybe people's beliefs away from each other. So it's what I call in the book sorting and extremism. On the other hand, conspiracy theories seem to be types of beliefs. And so we can ask, is there anything general we can say about this type of belief? But they both fall under political epistemology because they're both related in some way to politics. So it's not a well-defined term, but it refers to the broad fact that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here that a lot of people want to study, basically. And just one other thing to say is that there's this other tradition of political epistemology in Marxist thought, in radical thought, which has to do with the notion of ideology. There's sort of questions about that because, it's not clear that if you're a Marxist materialist that you should think that the epistemology matters that much. You should probably just think that like the class relations and the material relations are what causes everything. So there's questions about kind of the structure of the theory there. But so there's, there's a history of political epistemology in a lot of different political and philosophical traditions.
But what actually counts as political? Because people might say that they have, for example, a political disagreement, that they're having a political debate, that when they're discussing a particular subject, they're talking politics there. And there are people that even claim, and we can get a little bit more into that, that everything is actually political.
Yeah.
So, but what does really count as something political?
So this is a question. This is the question that I start my book with, and I've talked about this with a lot of people, and I haven't been super satisfied by any of the answers. There are some things that seem obviously political. If you go to Washington D.C. and you see people yelling at each other about what the tax rate should be, and then people maneuver, and there's sort of like some compromise, or they're trading favors. If you vote on this bill this way, then I'll vote on that bill that way.
Yeah.
Or if they go to war or try to win an election against each other or try to get a judge appointed or something like that, these things seem obviously political.
Mhm.
So there are questions about what makes these things political. One aspect is that there seems to be some kind of struggle in a lot of them, right? So there's some sort of dispute at the beginning, and resolving that dispute, or kind of failing to resolve that dispute, whether you resolve it or not, that seems to be part of the politics of what's going on. Another aspect is that sort of the dispute is resolved. The goal of the dispute is to sort of set something up in society in a certain way, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's the tax rate, or a question of whether we'll go to war or not. So these are what I call conflict and order in the book. So you start with conflict, you want to set something in order. And then there's another notion which I've never been quite as clear on, which is the notion of power.
Mhm.
So a lot of people say, and this has to be included just because, this is a book that's academic facing, but also public facing. And in public, a lot of people will just say the phrase politics is about power. So I don't really know what any of the words in that sentence mean. We're trying to define politics, trying to define power. The word about is like one of these insanely vague words that can mean completely different things in different contexts. But it seems like here the power has to do with the setting in order. So it's about the power to determine how things will go. And it does seem like even if you're not setting something specific in order, if you're trying to gain power for some future goal of setting things in order to resolve a conflict or to win in a conflict, then you're doing politics as well. Unfortunately, it just seems that there's also, we can come up with counter examples to all of these, power, conflict, and order. There's counter examples where, okay, you're using power, but it's not political power. There's a conflict, but it's not a political conflict. You made some arrangement, but it's not a political arrangement. And you can even have all three at the same time. So it doesn't seem necessarily the case that there seems to be maybe some background notion of political, where we have an idea of what is a political conflict and a non-political conflict. We have an idea of what is political power and non-political power. We have an idea of what is a political arrangement and a non-political arrangement. So that's, that whatever that background idea is, that's sort of what we want to figure out. And I don't think I made any progress on figuring that out. I hope somebody else does. Regarding this question of whether everything is political, the first thing to say, which I don't think I even mentioned in the book, but one of the first things you see when people talk about this online is basically like, any word that actually applies to everything, ceases to be meaningful, right? If you think extensionally about definitions, right? A definition is meant to pick some things out and exclude other things. That's how you communicate information, right? So if somebody says, well, I'm going to get a little political here, you have like a rough idea of the sorts of topics they might discuss, right? They're probably not going to talk about the weather unless they're talking about climate change, right? They might not talk about television unless they're talking about the political content of some show, or if they're talking about, what is the government body that regulates what's on television or something like that. That would be political. But saying what happened on the soap opera yesterday, that doesn't seem political, right? So basically, first of all, it seems like the word political has some information in it, and if everything is political, then can't really have any information. But people also, people give arguments to the effect that everything is political. And I also, I just in general think that they're not very good arguments. One of the arguments that I sort of make fun of the most is, everything has some everything that exists now is the way that it is because of the past, right? Because of history. And that history involves political history, right?
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, the history also involves a lot of other things. And generally we don't say like, you know, that something's history makes it what it is, right? Um, if I'm sitting in a certain kind of chair, maybe the person got inspired to make this chair because he saw a sculpture, but that doesn't make the chair a sculpture, right? That's just sort of like a random fact about the history of the chair, right? So you have these random facts about the histories of objects and situations and people that can involve political facts, but that doesn't, that's just not the way that we use words, right? Um, so I've always been very confused by the notion that everything is political. Um, I have some suspicions about what people's motivations are in saying that.
Mm-hmm.
But one way in which I do think it's important to have a somewhat expanded concept of the political uh, is, just comes from the sorts of things I argue about and in my public work and with a lot of other people. Um, so I don't want to say that the political is just like passing laws, going to war, things like that, right? Um, because there are these chains of reasoning that justify, or at least when it comes to political beliefs, right? There are these chains of reasoning that justify those actions, going to war, passing a law. And it seems like our disputes about items in those chains of reasoning can themselves be political, and the beliefs we have that go into those chains of reasoning can themselves be political. So if I believe, somebody says we should go to war because this dictator is oppressing his own people. Um, so well, my belief about whether the dictator is oppressing his own people, that seems like a political belief, in part because it affects political decision about whether or not to go to war, right? So in the book, I think of political beliefs as being the things that affect political decisions, the things that are involved in public disputes that relate to political actions. Um, Now you ask, what is a political action? I'm going to table that, right? I'll let somebody else figure that out.
Okay, so but since we're talking here about political beliefs, what are political beliefs really about? I mean, there's a proposal that some people have that what they are really about what we ought to do, and if that's the case, then they are mostly moral beliefs. What do you think about that? And if you disagree, I mean, what's your take on what a political belief is?
So like I was saying, I think political beliefs are beliefs that are involved in these chains of reasoning. At least the theory I give in the book. I'm sure somebody will
Mhm.
prove it wrong. But the theory that I give in the book is political beliefs, well, there's two types.
Yeah.
I mentioned before how a lot of politics is about being in groups, right? So one type of political belief is a belief that sort of says, I'm in this group, you're in that group. Um, and one issue in American politics, at least, is that we seem to have a lot of beliefs like this right now. This is what Robert Talisse calls political saturation. Um, so non-Americans are often surprised when I explain this, but um, so like Republicans tend to drink coffee from one coffee company and Democrats tend to drink coffee from another coffee company. So you might say our beliefs about which coffee is better are political beliefs because they sort of, they separate one group from another. I don't know. That's something, I'll let other people decide. I more want to broach the issue on that kind of topic. The other kind, which is maybe a little bit more central, is that when we have chains of reasoning about what to do in politics, what political actions to take, it seems to me that whenever items in those chains are in dispute or in conflict, um, our beliefs about them are political. So, of course, it's a political belief whether or not we should raise the tax rate. Um, but one item in that chain of belief might be, uh, does raising the tax rate uh, disincentivize people from starting businesses, for example, right? Some economists might think yes, some economists might think no. That's a question in economics, but my belief about it, I'm calling a political belief because the dispute about it could be a dispute that, the resolution of which would resolve the question about the political action, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, whenever anything in one of these kind of publicly controversial chains of reasoning is in dispute, I'm going to call it a political dispute, and I'm going to call the beliefs people have about it political beliefs. That's my approach at the moment. That's the approach I end up with in the book.
Right. But when there's political disagreement or political disputes, where does the disagreement stem from? Is it because people disagree over facts or values, because they
Yeah,
just use words differently, because they struggle over particular kinds of issues like finite resources or something like
yeah.
that? I mean, and is it usually just one single issue? I mean, would there be an overarching theory of political conflict here or not?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm sort of boring about this issue. I call myself boring whenever I don't have like a big theory and I say there's like different types.
Yeah.
So there are people who have big theories about this. So in particular, you have these political realists, some of whom seem to say, well, there's all the apparent disagreement is kind of like papering over the like Hobbesian struggle for resources, right?
Mhm.
Just I want something, you want the same thing. Maybe we come up with these pretend reasons why I should get it and you should not get it. But those are all the basic fact is that we want the same thing, right? And the reasons are just us trying to justify and us trying to rationalize getting what we want. That's not what I believe. I believe these four sources of conflict you talk about are all present in politics. And I think it's really important not to. There's an old blog post by a blogger called Scott Alexander where he gives sort of like a simpler and like a little bit less clear version of this question of where does political conflict come from.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so he calls one type of theory mistake theory and another type of theory conflict theory. Um, where the mistake theory is, yeah, but there's political disagreements because, and political conflict because some people made mistakes, right? Just like you might, if you're doing the math, you come up with the wrong answer. So we have different answers. And then other people think, oh yeah, we have different values or we're arguing over resources. Well, I just think sometimes each of those things can happen. It's just a complicated world. Different sorts of things happen at different times. So I'm not motivated to say any of these things as sort of like the central or univocal cause, or unique cause, I guess is the right word, of political conflict. I certainly think that, drilling down, one thing I talk about when I talk with, say college students about uh, how to argue with people about politics and how to make those conversations productive, um, is sort of like, yeah, you want to drill down and get at what is the root of the conflict, right? What is really
Yeah.
driving this conflict? And sometimes it can be different values, right? Like, why does one person support gun rights and the other one doesn't? Well, maybe the first person just thinks self-reliance is just so important. People should be able to be self-reliant, even if it raises the chance that they accidentally shoot themselves, right? It's a price we pay, right? Safety is not as important as self-reliance. Other people say, no, safety is like one of my most important values. I don't want people to be injuring themselves with guns, right? So that
Mhm.
seems like, and that's a pretty tame way maybe of putting that disagreement, but it seems that we can have those disagreements where there are these principles or values and people just weigh them differently. Um, and some of the psychological theories of political beliefs seem to be about that, seem to be about how do we weigh these values, and are there different types of people who weigh values in different ways. On the other hand, some people could also just say like, well, I looked at the statistics, uh, and there just are so many, self-inflicted injuries from guns that even if you only weigh safety a little bit, you should be against them. Or you might say, well, actually, there are basically none. So even if you weigh safety a lot, it shouldn't worry you that much, right? So the empirical question of like how many injuries actually are there? If say different people are studying this issue with different methodologies, or if the data is unclear or fuzzy or something like that, which is the case in studying so many political issues, it's just very hard to get the right answers. And especially for somebody like me with a kind of broad skepticism about kind of like the current knowledge production industry and expertise, then yeah, you can have a disagreement which is over empirical facts, and that can generate a political disagreement, right? And then you can have these verbal disagreements. Well, sometimes you think you're disagreeing with somebody, and it just turns out, if somebody says Trump is a fascist, and I say I don't think Trump is a fascist, and they think, oh, this guy loves Trump, and then we start arguing, and then it comes out in the argument that's just like, oh no, we just think about fascism, like I'm just using this term, in a slightly different way than you are, and we're both on the same side of the politics of it. So we're really disagreeing about the word fascism rather than about Trump or about politics. Now it could still be that whether a verbal disputes can still be important in various ways. But I feel like it's important to know when that's what you're arguing about, rather than arguing about the world or arguing about what's important or valuable.
Right.
And then for this last type of conflict, this sort of raw conflict, I think that is a type of conflict that is really important to, take in political theory. And this is an area where I don't know much, like I haven't read, a lot of like Hobbes and Rousseau and people like that are not. I'm reading a lot of contemporary epistemology most of the time, right? But I know that in Hobbes and Rousseau, there are these questions of, does the world start with conflict or not? Is there, if you go back before political institutions, to what extent do we have conflict? Maybe it's just a state of pure conflict, right?
Yeah.
Without anything to resolve that conflict, without the politics to resolve that conflict. And so these pure conflicts in our sort of modern society, where we're always arguing about politics and giving reasons and things like that, the pure conflict might start to dissipate in our thinking. But it also may be that this is sort of like, pretty fundamental to why we even have politics to begin with. So I think it's important to keep the possibility of just pure conflict over resources, pure struggle, me wanting one thing and you wanting another. It's really important to keep that in mind. It's like it's an ineliminable fact of human life.
And another very important thing here for us to try to understand is, or at least that people try to explain, is where political beliefs come from. Where do they stem from? There are different theories of political beliefs out there, and you go at least through the main ones in your book. So I would like to ask you about each particular one of them, to tell us about what you think are their strengths and limitations. So to start with, theories based on type or personality, we have, for example, moral foundations theory by Jonathan Haidt, theories based on particular personality traits like authoritarianism, or, for example, people that do work based on the big five personality traits sometimes talk about openness to experience, conscientiousness, and other kinds of personality traits. So what do you make of those types of theories?
Yeah, I think in general, I think there's two things for me to say. One is sort of like my background intuition, just based on my experiences in the world. And the other is sort of my evaluation of the ability of these theories once I looked at them sort of academically to explain political beliefs. So my experience of the world is really that you have, in all different political groups, you have different types of people. And in each political group, you have leaders and followers. In each political group, you have moralists and pragmatists and idealists. Ideologies need to be able to bring in all sorts of people. You have true believers and grifters. Online, I participate in this sort of like social justice and anti-social justice, wars, culture wars, right? And on each side, you have people who really believe what they're saying, and you also have people who are, trying to sell something, who are kind of like trying to make a buck by becoming like an influencer or something like that, right? Um, so it's my impression is just that politics always involves, at least in terms of political actors, there's all different types of people, and each group will have, you know, different types of people in different ways. The other thing to say is sort of like examining these theories, you start to have questions about what the measures of personality are and just how correlated they are with politics. So for example, looking at the publications in moral foundations theory, which has been pretty influential, and in my circles has been pretty influential, right? Because like I said at the beginning, my circles are these are or at least where I started out in my public writing and thinking about these issues, were sort of circles with these liberals who were sort of like, well, we don't understand conservatives, and maybe if we try to understand conservatives better, we'll understand politics better. We'll understand American politics better. We'll understand why people have reasons for their beliefs, and we'll be able to improve our own beliefs, right? That's the dream, in a sense, the epistemological dream, right? Improving our beliefs. Now, so the idea of one of the attractions of moral foundations theory was that it gave us a clean way of saying, what are we not appreciating about conservatives, right? So we weren't appreciating that there were these, so just to give an overview of moral foundations theory is the idea that there are these, that there's a set of kind of basic moral principles or ways of looking at the world or perspectives, a set of 5 or 6 of these, some of which are based individualistically and some of which are not solely about individuals. And the claim of moral foundations theory is that liberals see the world morally in terms of these individualistic foundations, but not the other ones. Whereas conservatives have both the individualistic and the sort of group-based or purity-based or loyalty-based foundations that aren't about individuals per se.
Right.
Individualistic ideas are sort of like safety, care, liberty, respect, dignity, all things that you could say, I respect a person should be safe, the human dignity, things like that.
Yeah.
And these other values are more about hierarchy and community and the sanctity of symbols and things like that. And the idea is that those are the conservative ones. So the notion was, if we liberals start thinking in terms of these other things, then maybe we'll appreciate where conservatives are coming from, at least, right?
Mhm.
But it turns out, if you look at the actual data in the papers on moral foundations theory, the sort of correlations of these so-called foundations showing up in the research, it's not like, it's not a chart that is like this incredibly big line, right? It's actually a very smooth, it's a very smooth and gentle change from becoming liberal to becoming conservative, right? And it doesn't make it scientifically uninteresting, but it makes it a little less clear how we can turn it into a theory of politics, and of political belief. Another issue is that all of these foundations can kind of attach to different things. And it started to seem to me, and I don't think I really explained this in the book as I was going through this theory, but it started to seem to me that what political group we're a part of depends much more on what these notions attach to rather than whether we have these notions at all, right?
Mm.
So one thing a lot of people said in, say, 2017, 2018, when they were reading moral foundations theory, this notion of purity, which was supposed to be a solely conservative notion, a lot of people said, well, there are left-wing notions of, purity, trying to make sure you're not involved in anything problematic, trying to make sure you don't use the wrong words, trying to make sure that you don't use the wrong symbols. That seems like a kind of notion of purity, right? And similarly, like take the so-called individualizing foundation of care. Well, there's the question of who do you care about, right? You're going to care more about some people than others, and that seems like a political question as well. So it started to seem to me that most of politics is not in these foundations, but is in sort of like what are the real world dynamics of how people apply these foundations, and how they apply them selectively. And that
Another,
is, yeah, sorry, go
no,
ahead.
go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say that is, moral foundations theory is probably the best of those theories. A lot of the other theories that are based on personality are much more. They just start from the perspective that, Haidt at least started from the perspective. Jonathan Haidt, the sort of guy behind moral foundations theory, Haidt at least started from the perspective of, well, let's try and understand let's try and understand people and see what we can appreciate about different views. A lot of the personality theories, and really a lot of the psychological theories of political belief overall, they start from the perspective of, I know what's right and wrong in politics. And so I'm gonna explain the deviancy of the people who disagree with me in some term or another. So the idea of the authoritarian personality is a great example of this, or the idea of the rigidity of the right. That's a model under which right-wingers are just sort of like cognitively inflexible. But you also see this stuff from centrists where they kind of take these sorts of models and just apply them to everybody on the extreme. So if you're an extremist of some sort, you must, it's almost a way of saying if you're an extremist, you have a personality disorder, right? And that's the explanation for political beliefs.
Yeah.
Or correlations with dark triad traits. So the dark triad of Machiavellianism and narcissism and psychopathy, or sociopathy. Some studies have suggested there are correlations with that and political extremism. So I think, I find flaws in all these things, but I also have just sort of like this background view of like, this isn't the way we should proceed in political epistemology. We shouldn't start by, sort of like hating people we disagree with and trying to justify it, basically. I don't think that's the right way. And it's not an approach that is consistent with the epistemological perspective, which is one which entertains the possibility of error and doubt and skepticism, and has since Descartes, if not before.
So another set of theories is based on ideology. What do you make of them, and what do you think, or how do you look at the role that ideology might play in political beliefs?
Yeah, so I think ideology is a really interesting notion. And I have certain kinds of skepticism about whether people really have ideologies. So ideological theories try to explain, at least in the most classical Marxist sense, ideological theories, I'm probably going to make some mistakes here. Ideological theories try to explain why society is stable using posits about the beliefs that people have. So, if you start from the perspective of we live in a super unjust society that doesn't benefit the people in it, then, or most of the people in it, or something like that, then you have to give an explanation of why are the people in this society, why are they not changing things up? Why are they not having a revolution, or why are less of them going on strike or something like that? And you posit ideology to say, well, these beliefs have been sort of put in their heads, which tell them you shouldn't have a revolution, right? It's okay. It stabilizes the society if they say to themselves, it's okay that I have less money than the other person because I don't deserve it, right? So that's ideology in the Marxist sense, is when people say, well, I have this background sense of how things ought to be, and that makes it okay that society is the way that it is, and that stabilizes society. So that's why a lot of theorists of ideology talk about it as having a functional role, And that also means that the concept of ideology has an explanatory role when it comes to the stability of society and the fact that there aren't revolutions, the fact that we're still in a capitalist system. Capitalism there not meaning an ideology of capitalism, but just capitalism as a certain social structure.
Yeah.
So this notion has been extended past the Marxists. One thing that has happened, since the 60s in academia is that different sorts of Marxist theories have been applied to categories like race and gender. And so you have basically theories of ideology explaining, why would a black person accept racial inequality, or why would a woman accept sex inequality? Well, it's because there's this ideology of white supremacy or this ideology of patriarchy, which to an extent has been internalized. So these ideology theories are often theories of the internalization and legitimation and moralization of unjust social structures. Now, what do I think of ideology theories? This is a good question. One thing to say about ideology theories is that this functional role aspect is something that I have some skepticism about. I think that if you look at people's political beliefs and say, well, this is sort of coming at them from above for this nefarious reason. I sort of start out with a lot of skepticism towards that idea of how people get their beliefs to begin with, right? I tend to think most people get their beliefs, including their beliefs about politics, from having some sort of contact with reality. And in fact, in the Marxist theory, there's the ideology theory is sort of combined with the opposite theory, which is class consciousness, which says, yes, from being in the lower class, you do have an enhanced contact with reality, right? You actually have an epistemic advantage. The class disadvantage in Marxism leads, in at least some part, some Marxist circles, leads to an epistemic advantage. I also don't. So if we think of an ideology as sort of comprehensive or sort of big in some way, right? It structures the way people look at the world, which is one way people think about ideology. It's not clear to me. So it's really easy for somebody like a philosopher to say, well, of course, people have all these ideas in their heads and they're trying to make them consistent and they're making inferences from them and they're constantly like cogitating and intellectualizing everything they experience. It's not clear to me that most people, that is like a sort of anxious response, and a sort of overthinking that we find maybe intellectually productive use for in academic philosophy. But it doesn't seem to me that most people have such structured ways of thinking about the world. And in fact, there's classic work by the political scientist Philip Converse, which suggests, most people don't seem to have ideologies. And, there's work by people like Michael Hannon, Olufemi Taiwo, about whether people have these political beliefs to begin with, whether people really have any political beliefs at all. So I think I have some skepticism that these big structures, which are really sort of intellectualizations, whether they really can play any causal role when it comes to thinking about people's individual political beliefs. Now, that doesn't mean that ideology. It could be that the notion of ideology still has, can still be an important notion in political theorizing. But that would be different than saying that individuals have ideologies, right? So, for example, here's one way that you could have an ideology at the level of society without individuals having an ideology, right? It could be that different people have different pieces of the ideology, and for various reasons, the person with this piece of the ideology gets a say at this moment, and the person with that piece of the ideology gets a say at that moment. And so that's a way that you could have, without individuals having an ideology, you could still have some sort of society-wide ideology. Now, would it then be best to think of it as a set of political beliefs? Well, probably not exactly. It would be better to think of it as sort of like a set of social incentives and a set of um, dynamics in which yeah, different people are brought forward at different times or have power in different contexts. And this has to do with how conducive those people's views are to some, I don't know, some power structure or whatever you would want to call it. So you can still have, maybe the notion of ideology can still be useful, even if you don't think people have ideologies or individuals have ideologies. I also, in the book, I make this quick note, which I've considered coming back to. And maybe we'll talk about this later. There's this notion of conspiracy theory, which is a big topic in political epistemology, just because conspiracy theorizing seems to a lot of people to be very bad. It's bad for society, and also seems to people to be bad reasoning. Yeah. But a lot of theories of ideology sort of sound like conspiracy theories, right? They sort of sound like, well, there's this group of people who are advantaged in society, and they sort of put a lot of ideas in people's heads to pull the wool over their eyes about what's really going on, right? In order to keep their power. So I have a lot of skepticism about narratives like that. Not because I have skepticism about that because I don't think it's so easy to pull the wool over people's eyes. I do think people want to pull the wool over each other's eyes, right? Like people aren't so great. But I also don't think people are that gullible either.
What about group membership? What do you make of theories that try to explain political beliefs on the basis of a group membership?
So this is sort of like the other side of the coin that I was talking about, where, in the Marxist conception, the relevant groups are classes, right? Or economic strata, or different relations to production, groups with different relations to production. Now, these theories can be very useful, especially in American politics, right? A lot of American political commentary is, turns out actually, there's more, you do a poll and there's more Hispanic support for Donald Trump this time than there was last time. So then you're like, wow, what is this, why do Hispanics like Trump more? And you have this whole, and there do seem to be correlations where, men vote Republican more often and women vote Democrat more often. White people vote Republican more often and Black people vote Democrat more often. So in the US, it seems really useful. But on the other hand, these correlations are not actually that strong either, right? So for example, Hispanics, these days it's around maybe 2/3 vote for Democrats and 1/3 vote for Republicans. So to me, that doesn't seem like we're going to get a great background view of where people's political beliefs come from. And in fact, all these theories we were just talking about, theories of ideology, they're there precisely to explain why the correlations aren't that strong, right? The notion is precisely, well, actually, the lower classes, some of them believe in capital, right? Like some of them don't, some of them aren't Marxists. We have to explain that. So we throw in this notion of ideology, right? So in general, I think that theories of group membership, they're just not really full theories of political belief, because everybody acknowledges that, any given member of any demographic or economic group could support the exact opposite of what everybody else does, right? And so there are the source of, and I don't know how good a job I did explaining this in the book. Thinking back now, probably not that great. The source of, in Marxism, the source of the group or the class political belief has something to do with the interests of the class, right? So it's sort of like, the proletariat class interest will determine the proletariat beliefs, and the capitalist class interest will determine the capitalist beliefs in some sense or another. It's important to distinguish this from theories of individual interest. So that's another kind of mysterious question of how do I sort of conceive of myself as a member of a class or group rather than an individual and sort of magically get the class interest into my head. There's obvious reasons why, we have a sense of our own individual interest because we have a sense of our desires, right?
Yeah.
It's not clear. This is another instance. The notion of class interest seems very intellectual and abstract. It's not clear to me that most humans are gonna be thinking about politics in this way, whether explicitly or implicitly.
So another set of theories has to do with social isolation. So what are the claims there?
Yeah, so these are theories that fit really well with contemporary American politics. And of course, with all these things, there's a difficulty of, this book is a very American book, right? I'm writing about dynamics that seem to be present in American politics right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these theories about social groups they're different from the group membership theories because they have to do with the incentives people have to sort of not avoid going against their group, right? So these incentives could be kind of internal or external, right? So the external incentive is like, if I'm a Democrat and I say taxes should be lower and everybody should own a gun, then maybe my friends aren't friends with me anymore, right? Maybe I get socially ostracized or something like that. The internal one is like, and this is the one that is really, really keyed to this current moment in American politics. The internal one is about maybe my sense of myself is tied up in a certain way with being a good Democrat or being a good Republican or being a good progressive or being a good conservative or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that means if I go against the group on a political issue, internally, I feel a struggle. Internally, I start saying, who am I? I start worrying that I can't make sense of my own identity, right? And so you have these two sources of pressure from the notion of political identity. And so, yeah, the theory basically says our political beliefs exist in part, or we have the political beliefs we do in part, reserve the external and internal appearance of having some kind of identity that corresponds with the political group. And yeah, so it's still a notion that is based on the fact that there are political groups, but the groups in question are different than in the group membership theories, and the relationship is also different. It's much more a relationship based on psychological incentives and things like that. And one thing to say about these identity and partisanship type theories is that they're not theories on which our political beliefs come out looking very rational. These are theories on which, we're doing motivated reasoning to avoid upsetting our social circle or upsetting our sense of who we are, Yeah. And that's not epistemologically secure, right? That's not looking at the evidence and making a reasoned judgment. It's sort of, reacting on instinct, reacting out of a sense of threat or something like that, a social or psychological threat.
So let me ask you about one final set of theories before we move on to another topic. You also cover theories based on cognitive heuristics. So what are these about?
Yeah. So this is really just one theory from the late Jeffrey Friedman, who was I wouldn't say a mentor, but invited me to a thing at Berkeley, and we had a lot of talks about political epistemology when I was just starting out in grad school. So he has basically a theory. It takes as its starting point sort of like the complexity of the modern world. And Friedman's notion is that we have to do something to cognitively to simplify the modern world. We have to be able to understand the modern world in some way. And I forget if he uses the term cognitive heuristics. It might be the term I use. basically the notion is we need a way to categorize all the different inputs we're getting.
Yeah.
Maybe we need some information is more important than others, or some people can be trusted and other people can't. Or some phenomena we reach for certain sorts of explanations, right, rather than others. Because if we couldn't do that, then you try to make just think of how many things are happening in the world. And if you're on Twitter like me, I think how many world events you see. You're familiar with the internal politics of all these different countries. Whenever I wake up early, I see all these tweets from my British friends about all everything that's happening in British politics. And then the Americans wake up and I hear about American politics, and then there's Asian politics, and it's sort of like if I want to make sense of this and avoid it being Friedman is working from sort of American pragmatist tradition. I think it's William James who he quotes that, or maybe it's someone else, but there's this phrase about I think about babies where before they have categories for their experience, they experience the world as a blooming, buzzing confusion, is the phrase, right? So the idea is if we don't want the world to just be like a confusing assortment of signs and symbols, we need boxes to put the things in. And Friedman basically said there's no rational way to pick one kind of categorization over another, one set of heuristics over another, because you're sort of pre-rational. The way you organize your information is prior to the rationality of digesting it and making inferences based on it. And so he basically thinks all of your politics will be determined by the set of cognitive heuristics that you're working with to simplify the informational sphere. So an example that I think in his life sort of went back and forth on, maybe in some sense, is the notion that people respond to incentives, which obviously is an assumption that economists make and political libertarians and other sorts of economic determinists and materialists and economic reductionists make, or class reductionists and Marxists make. The notion that people are going to respond to incentives helps us explain a lot of different things. Yeah, but according to Friedman, it's one of these like you can't really get behind it, right? It's not something that you can assess. It's just sort of like a way of making sense of the world, a kind of heuristic or even a kind of bias. So that's Friedman's notion. It's an interesting notion. I don't know if, to me, that it seems a little I don't know if I really believe in the hierarchy of there are these different kinds of things, one of which is a heuristic, and then there's a perception and the heuristic, and they're like completely different types of, maybe he doesn't mean to make such a strong assumption. But to me, it's always seemed that we can reevaluate our heuristics if they lead us astray. It can be very difficult, obviously, and we can get stuck in them, especially as we get older, less flexible. But I don't think we get stuck in quite the way. I call it tunneling. It's like tunnel vision you get, right, when you have these heuristics. I don't think it's necessary that we get tunnel vision in this way. I think a lot of people do, but that's sort of out of, the explanation for that is not going to be from like first principle. So he thinks this is like a first principle. It's just the way perception and complexity work, that we have to have these simplifications. I think it's more about like people are a little lazy and stuff like that.
So let me ask you now about the epistemology of democracy, which is also something that you cover in the book. So what is this about exactly? I mean, what are the kinds of questions that people raise when they talk about the epistemology of democracy? And since we're talking about epistemology here, should we trust what the majority believes?
Yeah, good question. So the notion of the epistemology of democracy, yeah, it's basically this question that you just asked of should we trust the majority? In the late 1700s, people started being interested in sort of statistical and mathematical justifications for democracy, and one of them from the Marquis de Condorcet, very, very simple notion, is just about how majority votes go if the voters are sort of independent. And it turns out that the more people you have voting, as long as they're reliable, and reliable, to a very small degree, just like better than chance, right? Better than a coin flip. To the extent that people are better than a coin flip, as you add people who are in some sense uncorrelated with one another, you actually get a completely reliable majority vote if the number of voters is high enough. So this is just like a mathematical fact. And so the epistemology of democracy, or democratic epistemology, is sort of a research program where people debate what does this mathematical fact have to do with real world democracy, in a sense. Well, this is one side of the epistemology of democracy. The other side, so that's what I call aggregative, right? Where you're aggregating a lot of different people. The other side of the epistemology of democracy is about deliberation, and the notion that if you have a group of people talking something over, just think about when you go to, when you have a hard decision, you ask other people for advice, right? It just seems that if we deliberate in a group, we get more reasons, we have more minds, right? We have more people helping to figure something out. It seems like bringing in other people, other smart people, always helps us make decisions. That's what we do. A very, very common practice for people to be asking advice in this way. And so you have these two sides, the aggregation and the deliberation. And in political theory, you would be using these to say, well, this is why democracy is good, right? That's not exactly my goal. Is the epistemological goal of the individual, which is sort of like, say I know that a group of people deliberated and came to a certain conclusion. Should I trust that conclusion, or like under what conditions should I trust that conclusion? Or say I see that there's a majority vote, under what conditions should I trust that majority vote? And so just taking these one by one, in the deliberating case, one thing we might want to say is, well, it depends on the internal dynamics of the deliberating group, right? So if there are sort of, I think Helen Landemore or somebody calls it reputational influences, right? If there are, or maybe it's what Cass Sunstein calls it, if there are these reputational influences where there's one person in there who everybody likes, or maybe who's like really physically attractive or something, and nobody wants to disagree with them, right? So they're just going to say what they want, and everybody's just going to go along with them. That's not a group I'm going to trust, right? Unless I trust that one person. Everybody's going along with the one person I trust, but then it's basically just the equivalent of only trusting one person, right? Did everybody feel free to speak? Things like that. That'll affect whether I trust the group. What are the incentives for giving good reasons or giving bad reasons? In the aggregative case, you want to know sort of like how good are the people who I'm aggregating and making decisions, their competency. And if it turns out that most people who are voting get things wrong most of the time, then you're not going to trust the vote, right? But if it turns out that most of the people voting get things right most of the time, then you are going to trust the vote. The other issue, which is very dear to my heart, probably to me one of the most important things in the book, one of the most important notions of the book, is this notion that if people are making up their minds independently, the majority vote of the group will be more reliable. And this is just what Condorcet's jury theorem says, and can be seen, mathematically. So in the book, I have two diagrams, of if you have three people and three issues, and each person is right about two out of the three issues and wrong about one. Well, if they're all wrong about the same issue, then the majority vote will get that wrong, right? But if they're all wrong about different issues, then the majority vote will get every issue right, right? So it's a way of, if you think about it, it's almost like investments. It's a way of like diversifying risk or something like that, right? Like it's a way of uncorrelating the risk, making sure that mistakes don't happen at the same time if people are thinking independently. Now there's a sort of paradox here, which is like, this is a reason to trust majority votes or to trust deliberation. But in trusting, these democratic mechanisms, I reduce the independence of my own decision making, right? By looking to them as a source for my beliefs. And that makes me actually worse at contributing to them, right? So there's this sense in which our epistemic responsibility in terms of our own beliefs may not be the same as our epistemic responsibility in some broader sense of contributing to a group, if that makes sense. I don't know if that does make sense.
Yes, it does. But then an alternative to the epistemology of democracy would be to trust the experts. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that so in the book, I lay out, I think, 7 different questions about the nature of expertise.
Yeah.
But the main question is like how well are the experts doing right now? Well, so there's 2 main questions for a novice, right? One is how well are the experts doing right now, and the other is can I even figure out who the experts are, right?
Yeah.
So the second question, can I even figure out who the experts are? This is called the novice expert question, or the novice expert problem. Alvin Goldman has a classic paper, Experts, Which Ones Can You Trust? About this problem. So the question is basically like, say there's some mathematicians disagreeing about a proof, 2 of them, and I'm trying to decide which one of them is right. One of them thinks it's valid, the other one thinks it's invalid. And so then I look at, how do I decide who's the math expert? Well, I can look at all the other opinions about math, but I don't know if they're right about those either, right? Because I'm not the math expert.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which to evaluate which one of them is the math expert, I have to be a math expert, right?
Yeah.
To even know who the expert is, especially in a case where experts are disagreeing. And I think this is important in political questions because in political questions, as we said, we're always in the situation of dispute or conflict, right? And one thing you see very commonly, especially in American politics, people will say, well, they have their experts and we have ours, right? You have think tanks, for example, you have right-wing and left-wing think tanks, which come up with, they publish research, maybe even peer-reviewed articles, and the different experts think different things. So it's, it can be very difficult if you have just one large literature on one side, one large literature on the other side. If you're not going to take the time to be an expert yourself, it's actually very difficult to choose a lot of the time. And this is, again, this is going to be very difficult to get out of political epistemology because politics involves conflict and involves dispute. So there are going to be experts disputing these things most of the time. Now, the question of how well the experts are doing, I talked before about, these questions from a little under a decade ago about the state of academic research, the state of social science, the state of psychological research. For me, one of the lessons of the replication crisis in social psychology, and also just one of the lessons from my own experience in academia, getting to know some experts, seeing what's put into different fields. It's not so much, expert knowledge is always changing. It's always in flux. Some of that is improvement, some of it is fashion. But I think my sense is that an ordinary person, if they see some press release, so say, let's take a practical situation, right? An ordinary person sees some press release that says, a scientist at our university, they proved this in their lab, and this is going to be so amazing, and it's going to have these great results. So just my experience. First of all, did they actually prove it or not? Who knows if it'll replicate? Who knows if the statistics were satisfying? Who knows if there's another scientist on the other side of the issue who has another paper saying the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Second question, is the finding even being reported accurately? Sometimes you talk to a scientist and they say, oh, it's so embarrassing. The university wanted to hype me up. And so they pretended I'd made this big claim, but really I'm making this very small academic point, So there's also a question of, as a reader, can I even really completely understand what's being claimed
Yeah.
In this scientific paper? So there's all these sorts of problems, and you start to, then, another question is which research gets in, becomes known to you as a normal person to begin with. Is it going to be the sort of depoliticized, day-to-day, highly reliable, workman-like research of a scientist? No, it's probably going to be the sort of research, the sort of thing that would make waves, especially in the angry clickbait era. The sort of research that is going to make its way to your consciousness as a normal person probably is going to be research that is political, that is likely to be in dispute, that is likely to be controversial in some way, and that people will think is relevant to political questions. So it's not, it's not clear to me that, the evidentiary value of the missives that a normal person gets from above, from the experts, is going to be very high to begin with, right? Because we don't know where they came from. We don't know what the state of the debate behind them is. We don't know exactly how to make sense of them. And the incentives that lead them to make their way to us are probably not great. So my general view is that, and this is all apart from the question of whether we can even make sense of the notion of a political expert, right? And whether there are moral experts and things like that. So my sense is that it's very difficult, even if one wanted to trust the experts. It's difficult to find them, and it's difficult to interpret their sort of signs and symbols.
So in the book, you also go through some political issues that people worry about, like polarization, conspiracy theories, fake news. Let's talk perhaps about conspiracy theories here. You have alluded to that earlier in our conversation. So what would you have to say from an epistemological standpoint about conspiracy theories?
Yeah, so I think conspiracy theories are difficult for epistemologists. It seems to, I think to a lot of epistemologists, it seems like there must be something wrong with conspiracy theories, but it can be very hard to characterize exactly what. And in fact, it can be a little difficult to even characterize what a conspiracy theory is. So, for example, in ancient Rome, there was a conspiracy that resulted in Julius Caesar being killed, right?
Yeah.
Believing that doesn't seem to make me a conspiracy theorist, even though I believe in the conspiracy. Maybe because it's become established fact, or maybe because it's so long ago or something like that. Then you also have these non-political conspiracies. So when I taught a class, what were they? There's a famous rapper from the 1990s, Tupac. So one of the conspiracy theories somebody came up with was that Tupac was still alive.
Yeah.
So that was their notion of a conspiracy theory. Is that a conspiracy? Well, I guess it depends on how many people know and how they were involved with him. So I think it can be a little bit hard to get a handle on exactly which phenomena we're talking about when we talk about conspiracy theories. There are some things that obviously seem like they're just like core instances of the phenomenon of conspiracy theories. And I do think that sometimes, there's basically two approaches when you have trouble defining something. You can say, well, let's work through all the examples and counterexamples, and let's, we really have to make sure, should this be in, should this not be in? Another is to just say, well, let's just talk about, there are some things that are obviously like core instances of the phenomenon. Let's just talk about them, right? So that's something we could have done when we were worrying about the definition of politics. We could have said, well, let's just think about the things that must be politics, going to war, signing a bill that says we're going to go to war, right? When the Republicans and Democrats disagree about it or something like that. So with conspiracy theories, the core ones, so take in America, the QAnon theory. Mm-hmm. This is, okay, I'm forgetting what it is. I think it involves a guy who calls himself Q, who claims to have some sort of inside source on government information, maybe claims to be a government agent himself, who makes these online posts that says that, here's what's going on within the government, here's what the information drop is going to be about, the abuses people are doing, or Hillary Clinton is doing that, or Bill Clinton is doing this.
Mhm.
And a lot of people are covering it up. A lot of the government is implicated, or a lot of the powerful people are implicated, and they're doing this for their own advantage. And sometimes for a very nefarious kind of advantage, right? Maybe to abuse children or something. So that obviously seems like a conspiracy theory. It posits a conspiracy. The conspiracy goes against the official story of the U.S. government and of U.S. power. It's a lot of people are acting badly, right? They're doing it for nefarious or evil purposes.
Mhm.
They're doing it secretly. They're doing it through secret mechanisms, things like that. So that seems like a clear case of conspiracy theory. On the other hand, if we look at those aspects, it's hard to say which of those renders the belief irrational, because certainly believing that people act in evil ways for their own interests is not by itself irrational.
Mhm.
Believing that people act in secret is not by itself irrational. Believing that powerful people can act in concert with each other, can coordinate their actions, that's not irrational. Um, and believing that sometimes your government is wrong, that doesn't seem irrational either, right? Um,
Mhm.
so once we come up with it, even in the core case, once we say these are the things that seem to contribute to it being a conspiracy theory, it's hard to say which of these is really the problem. Where did these people really go wrong? No, of course. So that's the problem with generalism, right? Generalism is sort of like we try to identify the aspects of a conspiracy theory and we say one of this just is irrational. Now, particularism is the approach where you look at a specific conspiracy theory and you say, well, they just don't have very good evidence for this. No, of course, that's probably true in a lot of the cases. Obviously, in QAnon, it's true. In the case of QAnon, it's true. But that's something where you can just say, well, there's this guy saying some stuff is going to happen, then mostly it doesn't happen. You only have one source. Everybody else, disagrees with the guy. So you sort of have, in general, if 100 people say one thing and one person says another thing, in general, you go with the 100 people, right? So in the case of QAnon, there's going to be specific things where you can look at, here are the dynamics of the theory, here are the dynamics of how people are acquainted with the theory, and those dynamics don't suffice to make a belief in it rational. But those dynamics will be different from one theory to another, right? They'll be different for different conspiracy theories. The thing that interests me, and this sort of came up with the notion of ideology, there's this way of people will take kind of conspiratorial beliefs and they'll remove the sort of individual agents from them and just say, well, the conspiracy is sort of like internalized or in people's heads somehow. Nobody's intentionally doing this. It just sort of emerges out of the structure of society. The conspiracy emerges out of the structure of society.
Yeah.
That I've never really understood why that's any different than individual agency. People always act with individual, whether they act with individual agency or don't, like that doesn't seem like something that licenses or changes the rationality of a conspiracy theory to me. So there's two types of explanation. It doesn't seem to me that one of them is going to be, if one of them is super irrational, the other one probably will be too. So basically, and I think this is the philosophical consensus right now. Basically, we have to look at conspiracy theories on their merits. Often they don't have, often they're not meritorious beliefs, rationally, not epistemically meritorious. But it's going to be hard to say something very general about what's wrong with conspiracy theorizing.
So let me ask you about just one last topic. So, because there are people that make claims about how the history of a particular society might also influence people's political beliefs. So, does that happen? I mean, does the history of our society have any bearing on our political beliefs?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think in the most general sense, the way our societies develop are going to affect social circumstances, and are going to affect kind of traditions, as well as intellectual traditions. There's going to be received wisdom and things like that. One thing I found interesting in writing this book was the sort of different views. Once I recognized that tradition was part of political epistemology, it struck me that, different political groups are characterized in part by different attitudes towards tradition. So obviously conservatives are usually bigger fans of tradition and progressives not so much, right? In a way, it's in the name, right? So progressives think we make progress, and conservatives want to keep what we've already got, right? And neither, without saying more, neither of those seem bad, right? What if we could make progress while also keeping the good things we already have? That would be insanely good, right? That would make for a really great society. But so there's a few different ways of looking at. So from the progressive side, there's this fact that I think to a lot of people at least seems difficult to dispute, this fact of moral progress. So the fact that for almost all of human history, it wasn't taken as obvious that you shouldn't own slaves. Of course, in America, we had chattel slavery, which was racialized, or which was just, based on race or whatever the right word is. But even in other, there were Aristotle wrote in favor of slavery, or defended slavery. You had slavery in basically, my understanding is most civilizations, for most of human history. So we've made progress by recognizing that slavery, in some sense, is just an extreme affront to morality and dignity and things like that. And so the progressive view might be, well, as time goes on, we'll keep having, we'll keep figuring out what's right and wrong, we'll keep making progress with it. We'll keep figuring it out. And on the other side, you have some arguments about why we shouldn't change things so much. Now, one argument, so G.K. Chesterton has a couple arguments. He's a great British traditionalist, or conservative, or whatever the right word is, defender of tradition. One argument is the idea of the democracy of the dead. Basically, like, if you believe in democracy and believe that adding people makes things better, why not include the perspectives of people who have already come before us, right? And another is this idea of Chesterton's fence. So he says, before you destroy something in society, you have to make sure you understand why it's there, right? The people who built it know why they built it. And if you don't know why it's there, that means that they have the advantage over you, right? That means you should trust them because they're experts on why it was built. Then in a slightly different way, Friedrich Hayek has the same view. I mean, Hayek believes that even the people who built it probably don't understand why it was there. So Hayek has a more sort of invisible hand evolutionary type approach where he says, just as no one person can understand why an item is priced the way it is, no one person can understand why a social structure is what it is and what functions it might serve. So just like the theorists of ideology, he talks about the functional role that things play in society. But he thinks that those functions can be very obscure to us. And so in terms of resolving these disputes about political epistemology between progressives and traditionalists, well, I don't think it's, I don't think it's something that has a final resolution necessarily, or at least not one that I've found. But I did start to wonder about this notion of moral progress a little bit as I was writing. And I started to wonder why, okay, so I know obviously we're doing better now from my perspective than we were back when people didn't realize how bad slavery was, right? We've made progress in figuring out that slavery is bad. And then maybe in 100 years, there will be another change where people say this thing is good or this thing is bad, and they'll disagree with me. One thing I didn't quite understand when I was thinking about moral progress is why, what is it about 100 years passing that should make me think they're right and I'm wrong? Why shouldn't I say, well, I'm the high point. I'm right about everything. People in the past were wrong about slavery, then it'll change again, and people in the future will be wrong about this other thing, but I can stick with my own beliefs, right?
Yeah.
And so I was trying to figure out why that was. One is just maybe you just infer from the fact that progress has been made so far, to the notion that it'll continue to be made. That seems like a strong, that seems like an unlikely inference. Yeah, so I'm still thinking about this question of moral progress a lot. And there's different areas, of political life where the notion of moral progress is relevant. I really think it's an under-discussed notion, the notion of progress. There's questions of whether morality really works like science. What assumptions do you need to make about morality and politics to even think that there's an analogy between moral or political progress and scientific progress? Probably some pretty robust assumptions. So that I'm glad you asked about that. That is, so the connection between political epistemology and history, probably of everything in the book, is the thing that has been that's like completely new. I don't think anybody has discussed that before. So I'm excited to see what people think of it at least. But yeah, so I appreciate you asking about it.
Great. So the book is again Political Beliefs, a philosophical introduction, and I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Oliver, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, so I keep a site on Weebly, olivertraldi.weebly.com. You can find, I do a lot of public writing, so you can find my book reviews and cultural essays and things like that there. I have a Twitter account, but usually, I'm not very good at Twitter, so people can find me there if they like. And yeah, I appreciate you having me on.
No, of course. I really loved the book, so thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been fun to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.